morning mist clung to London Bridge like a shroud as rows of rotting heads stared down from their pikes, empty eye sockets serving as silent warnings. But on August the 23rd, 1305, those grim relics would witness something even more horrifying than their own fate. That day, the most infamous prisoner in England was dragged through the streets beneath them, beginning a journey that would end in one of the cruelest executions medieval law had ever conceived. This wasn't just about ending a man's life, it was about obliterating a legend. William Wallace had once been Scotland's greatest warrior, a common-born knight who had united fractured clans and crushed English forces that outnumbered his own 3-1. Now stripped bare and tied to a wooden hurdle, he was about to learn what King Edward V meant when he vowed to create an example that would echo through eternity. What follows isn't a Hollywood tale. This is the grim historical truth of how medieval justice turned a national hero into scattered body parts displayed across 4 kingdoms. What most people don't understand about medieval executions is that they weren't merely punishments. They were theatrical acts of psychological warfare engineered to terrify and control. And Wallace's death would become the crown jewel of that brutal pageantry. By the time this story ends, you'll know why even veteran soldiers vomited at the sight, why mothers turned their children's faces away too late, and why even 7 centuries later the events at Smithfield still leave a mark too savage to forget. But the real twist, Wallace was never meant to be in this story at all. Just 8 years earlier, he was a nobody, a landowner's son with no legacy, no prophecy, no path to greatness. Then the English came to his door, and what they did that day turned a peaceful man into Britain's most feared guerrilla warrior. And what Edward Longshanks did in response transformed that warrior into a symbol that history couldn't erase. The road to his capture was drenched in blood and paved with betrayal. By 1305, after years of brutal war, most of Scotland's noble families had bowed to Edward, deciding that their titles and estates were worth more than the dream of independence. But Wallace, a defiant commoner who had never bent the knee to an English king, remained free, and that defiance made him dangerous. Edward's spy network blanketed Scotland with informants hiding in plain sight. Tavern keepers, merchants, priests, any of them could be on the king's payroll. The bounty on Wallace's head was astronomical, £30 sterling, enough to buy a manor. The threat was clear: help him and you die with him. The walls were closing in. Wallace's trusted circle grew smaller by the day. When betrayal finally came, it was cruel and inevitable. Sir John Meneth, a Scottish knight who had recently aligned with Edward, orchestrated the ambush. Some accounts even point to Jack Short, a servant in Wallace's own household, hinting at treachery that ran disturbingly deep. The exact details remain murky, blurred on purpose by those who sold him out. But we know that on August 5th, 1305, near Robston outside Glasgow, Wallace walked into a trap he never expected. Picture it: after years of running and fighting, Wallace finally lowers his guard among familiar faces. Then the sudden chaos, the swarm of armed men, the sickening realization that he's been betrayed. The records don't capture his exact response, but they all agree he was taken alive. Whether by shock or choice, he did not resist. Maybe he still believed that justice, Scottish justice, would protect him. He was wrong. The march south was slow and humiliating, a punishment in itself. This man who once sent English armies fleeing at Stirling Bridge was now shackled and caged, paraded through villages as a living trophy. He was jeered by crowds who had only heard monstrous legends. Children pelted him with stones. Women spat. Men who'd never seen a battlefield screamed hatred at the silent prisoner behind iron bars. But the worst part wasn't the bruises or the chains, it was the growing certainty of what London held in store. Wallace knew the law of the land. He knew what it meant to be called a traitor, and he knew all too well that his final performance was about to begin. During those long, punishing days on the road, Wallace had more than enough time to imagine the horrors Edward had prepared for him, and Edward, ever the master of psychological torment, ensured Wallace's thoughts stayed dark. London in August was a city of suffocating contrasts, where the foul stench of sewage and rotting fish clung to the air, and narrow alleys trapped the heat like a furnace. When Wallace finally arrived on August the 22nd, the entire city seemed to pour into the streets, not out of curiosity, but driven by a bloodlust carefully stirred by royal propaganda. That night Wallace was held at the home of William de Eyre on Fenwick Street, and one can only imagine the weight of that final evening. He knew that what awaited him wasn't merely death, but a dismantling so thorough that his body would be torn apart and scattered across the land. Guards later claimed they heard him praying, though whether for deliverance or the strength to endure what was coming, no one can say. What we do know is that when dawn broke, Wallace met it with the resolve of a man who had already made peace with his fate. His final procession to Westminster Hall wasn't the quiet shuffle of a condemned man. This was a deliberate, meticulously planned spectacle. Wallace was placed on horseback not to honour him, but to humiliate him publicly, surrounded by the Mayor of London, sheriffs, aldermen, and a parade of knights. This wasn't a transport. It was a victory parade designed to show London that the once mighty rebel was now nothing more than a defeated captive. Westminster Hall, the largest of its kind in Europe, loomed like a cathedral to royal power. Its towering beams arched like the rib cage of a colossal beast, and that morning it was crammed with spectators who had paid dearly for the best view of the show. A wooden platform had been raised at the southern end so that no one would miss a moment. And then came one final insult. As Wallace stepped onto the stage, they crowned him with a laurel wreath. According to the London Chronicles, it was meant to mock a supposed boast that Wallace had claimed he deserved to wear a crown in Westminster Hall. Whether he ever said such a thing is doubtful, but it didn't matter. The symbolism was everything. Edward's propagandists twisted Wallace's fight for Scotland's freedom into arrogance, painting him not as a patriot, but as a deluded usurper. The laurel mocked not just Wallace, but the very idea of an independent Scotland. The 5 commissioners seated in judgment were no neutral jury. Handpicked by Edward and led by Sir Peter Mallory, they were loyalists selected for their reliability in delivering the king's foregone conclusion. When Mallory rose to read the charges, the room went silent. The list was long and merciless. Wallace stood accused of treason, sedition, arson, robbery, and mass murder. They blamed him for massacres, for raids into northern England, for attacks that spared neither woman nor child, priest nor peasant. The portrait they painted was monstrous, but strategically so designed to erase any trace of heroism and replace it with villainy. But here's the legal twist. Under English law, Wallace couldn't technically be guilty of treason. Treason required betraying a sworn sovereign, and Wallace had never sworn allegiance to Edward. He had fought for King John Balliol and later for Scotland itself. English authorities knew this loophole, which is why they introduced the claim that Wallace had attempted to crown himself King of Scotland. It was a lie, but a necessary one to justify the sentence they were about to deliver. When Mallory finished, he gave Wallace a chance to speak not as a courtesy, but as part of the performance. And Wallace in that moment delivered the single defiant line history would remember. The exact words vary, but the meaning never changes. I cannot be a traitor, for I owe him no allegiance. He is not my sovereign, he never received my homage, and whilst life is in this persecuted body, he never shall receive it. Think about the steel it took to say that, standing alone, mocked and surrounded by enemies, fully aware that what followed would be agony beyond imagining. He didn't plead, he didn't apologise, he didn't even try to humanise himself. He simply restated the belief that had driven his entire rebellion. Scotland was not England's to rule, and William Wallace would never call Edward king. The response from the court was as swift as it was predictable. Since Wallace had been declared an outlaw, English law stripped him of the right to speak in his own defence. His bold declaration meant nothing in the eyes of the court. The judges wasted no time. Sir Peter Mallory and his fellow commissioners moved immediately to sentencing, and what they handed down wasn't simply a death sentence. It was a meticulously crafted blueprint for the total annihilation of a human being. For treason, Wallace would be drawn through the streets of London to the place of execution. For robbery and homicide, he would be hanged. For crimes against the church, burning abbeys, killing clergy, he would be disemboweled and his entrails burned before his eyes. And for his collective offences, his body would be beheaded and quartered, the remains dispatched to different corners of the realm as a warning to all who dared dream of rebellion. Every step was calculated to prolong pain, magnify humiliation, and ensure that even in death Wallace would find no peace. The dragging would exhaust and injure him before the real execution even began. The hanging would push him to the brink of death, but deny its final mercy. The disembowelment would inflict unimaginable agony, and the quartering would erase him physically, scattering his remains so that no grave could become a rallying point for future rebels. But as horrific as this sounded, the reality would prove even worse. Within hours of the sentence, the machinery of execution lurched into motion. Guards seized Wallace and stripped him naked, a final indignity for a man who had once commanded armies. They bound him to a hurdle, a flat wooden frame built not just to transport a body but to inflict maximum suffering along the way. The executioners weren't amateurs, they were artisans of agony. They laid Wallace face down, his arms stretched wide and bound tightly with coarse rope that cut into his flesh. His legs were tied at the ankles, his entire body forced into full contact with the hard wood. Some accounts suggest a beam was placed under his chest to keep his head raised, ensuring he wouldn't be knocked unconscious by the relentless pounding of cobblestones. The route to Smithfield wasn't chosen for efficiency, it was selected for spectacle. Rather than take the shortest path, Edward's men designed a 4-mile procession that twisted through the busiest quarters of London. The purpose was clear: to parade the once mighty warrior like butcher's meat raw and broken for all to see. As the horses pulled the hurdle forward, Wallace's bare skin scraped against the stone streets. At first, the contact ripped through the outer layer of skin, creating patches of stinging abrasions. But as the journey dragged on, that friction tore deeper through muscle and sinew, exposing raw, bloody tissue to the filth of London's roads. Eyewitnesses described a gruesome trail, a widening smear of blood marking his passage through the capital. The crowd didn't merely watch, they participated. Some hurled rotten vegetable stones, even dung and animal carcasses. Others simply stared, fascinated by the destruction of a man once thought invincible. No guard intervened. This was all part of the choreography. Every insult, every projectile was another notch in the ritual of humiliation. In the eyes of the crown, Wallace wasn't a man anymore. He was a symbol being dismantled piece by piece. And here's where the myth diverges from the truth. Romantic versions often spare Wallace by having him pass out during the ordeal, but the brutal reality. The human body is resilient in ways that defy mercy. Wallace did not lose consciousness. Chroniclers noted that he remained awake, eyes open, mouth moving in what witnesses interpreted as prayer. The Llanos Chronicle records that he seemed to be reciting psalms, though the crowd's roar drowned out his words. Every bump, every jagged edge, every sickening jolt registered fully in a body already at the limit of endurance. And still, Wallace endured. The drag to Smithfield served far more than the purpose of moving a prisoner. It was the first act in a carefully staged public execution. It drained Wallace of the strength he might use to maintain dignity, reducing him to a broken, bleeding thing. It stripped away his humanity, turning the man who once led armies into a grotesque spectacle. And it let the crowd participate, letting them feel complicit in the destruction of a hated enemy. By the time they reached the execution ground, Wallace's back and buttocks had been scraped to raw tissue, flayed open by miles of cobblestones. Witnesses described seeing the glint of bone through the deepest abrasions. His face had taken a beating despite the chest being meant to protect it, broken teeth, a shattered nose, and one eye swollen completely shut. And yet somehow he was still alive, still aware, still conscious of what came next. Smithfield, long used for executions, was soaked in centuries of blood. On this day it had the feel of a festival. Vendors sold meat pies and ale. Families arrived early to claim good spots. Temporary wooden stands had been built for wealthy onlookers willing to pay to witness the death of a legend. Children sat on shoulders, the scent of hot food mingling with sweat and anticipation. At the centre stood the scaffold, a raised platform that turned death into performance. The man tasked with delivering this death was no amateur. Likely John Maylan, London's official headsman, he was dressed in a black hood not to hide his identity, but as part of the ritual turning a man into an extension of royal law. His assistants, 3 or 4 men, had arranged everything with precision. Knives had been sharpened to a surgeon's edge, the brazier blazed coals glowing orange hot. Chains, ropes, and the quartering block were laid out like instruments in an operating theatre. Wallace was dragged onto the scaffold, leaving smears of blood in his wake. As he was positioned before the crowd, the noise swelled to a roar and then dropped to a tense silence. This was the moment everyone had waited. For the moment, England's most hated rebel would be unmade. The hanging was the first step, and it was designed for pain, not mercy. The gallows was nothing more than a simple wooden frame with a hemp rope, but this was not the clean neck-snapping execution of later eras. This was deliberate strangulation. The executioner placed the knot behind Wallace's left ear, calibrated to constrict airflow slowly rather than break the neck. 2 assistants pulled the rope, hoisting Wallace, so his feet dangled just inches above the platform, high enough to strangle but low enough to keep his spine intact. The crowd watched as the life began to leave him inch by inch. His hands, though bound, twitched in clenched spasms. His legs jerked in wild, involuntary kicks, the source of the phrase the dance of death. His face changed colour as blood vessels burst one by one, first red, then purple. His tongue swelled and protruded, darkening to a near black. Foamy blood frothed at his lips as his throat tore internally. His one open eye bulged unnaturally, the other leaking blood-tinged fluid from the swollen socket. The executioner stood back unmoved, watching Wallace's suffering with calculated attention. The timing had to be perfect. Too long and Wallace would die now, ruining the remainder of the spectacle. Too short and the audience would be robbed of its climax. This was state violence as theatre, and Wallace, battered but still breathing, was about to enter its final and most horrific act. Too brief a strangulation and Wallace might recover too quickly, possibly retaining enough strength to resist the agony that followed. But after roughly 3 minutes, just long enough for him to fully experience the terror of suffocation without losing consciousness, Mallon gave the signal. The assistants released the rope and Wallace dropped hard onto the scaffold, his rected body offering no resistance. For a moment he lay limp and some in the crowd assumed he was dead. Then came the harsh ragged gasps as his crushed windpipe strained to pull in air. His chest heaved violently, his limbs convulsing like a fish flung on dry land. Bloody foam flew from his mouth with each tortured breath. This was the true art of the execution, not to kill but to bring a man as close to death as possible, then pull him back, forcing him to die again and again. While Wallace choked and spasmed, the assistants moved with cold efficiency. They dragged him to a specially designed table, thick wooden planks fitted with iron restraints placed at key joints. He was laid out spread-eagle shackles biting into raw, abraded flesh. The table was angled slightly so that the crowd would miss nothing. A leather strap held his head down, ensuring he couldn't look away from the horrors about to unfold. And then the performance escalated into something even the bloodthirsty audience wasn't prepared for. The executioner approached with a narrow razor-sharp blade crafted specifically for this ritual. He began with a careful incision just above Wallace's groin, slicing through skin and fat with almost surgical precision. Blood spilled quickly, streaming down his thighs. The crowd pressed closer. Some stared captivated. Others shifted uneasily. The emasculation began not in one stroke, but in stages designed to prolong pain and degrade dignity. The testicles came first, severed with precision, and held aloft before being cast into the brazier. The crackle and stink of burning flesh caused retching in the front rows. Then came the removal of Wallace's penis, done slowly with calculated cruelty. His screams rang out across Smithfield, long and anguished, the sound of a man being systematically destroyed. But that was only the beginning. The executioner moved on to the abdomen, lifting the knife once again. He made a long incision from sternum to pelvis, slicing through layers of flesh with deliberate care. The key was to avoid major arteries to keep Wallace alive for what came next. His experience showed. The cut was deep enough to expose, shallow enough to prolong. As the wound opened, spectators glimpsed something almost no one ever sees, that the living interior of a human body. Organs pulsed and shifted under the open sky. Some in the crowd turned away in horror. Others leaned in, morbidly fascinated by the forbidden spectacle. Wallace, still conscious, could lift his head slightly and see what was being done. The executioner reached into the cavity and began removing the intestines. He started with the small intestine coiled tightly inside the body, roughly 20 feet of it. With slow, practiced hands, he drew it out yard after yard of glistening tissue, holding it aloft for the crowd before tossing it into the flames. The smell was unbearable, the pain unimaginable. But even more than pain, there was a wrongness to it. A body turned inside out made a public object a thing. The burning of the entrails while Wallace watched wasn't just practical, meant to keep the platform clear. It was psychological warfare turning his final minutes into a theatre of torment. And still the worst was yet to come. Symbolically, the evisceration was more than torture, it was a destruction of the victim's inner self. In medieval belief, the bowels were thought to house courage, emotion, even the soul. Burning them before the victim's eyes was not only practical, it was psychological annihilation. Sensory-wise, the horror was amplified, the sharp stink of charred flesh, the foul reek of fecal matter from ruptured intestines, and the acrid smoke of the brazier created an atmosphere so overpowering that several spectators vomited. Wallace's screams no longer resembled human sound. They had become a high keening wail, less a voice, more an animal howl, a sound dragged from somewhere deeper than language. Accounts vary on whether he spoke actual words. Some say he prayed, calling on God and the Virgin Mary. Others say his vocalizations had transcended meaning, pure expressions of agony beyond speech. But all agree he was conscious, fully aware, watching as his body was methodically unmade. After the intestines came the other organs. The stomach, liver, and spleen were removed with almost surgical precision. Each was displayed to the crowd before being cast into the fire. The kidneys required the executioner to reach deep into Wallace's body cavity, his arms disappearing nearly to the elbow in blood and tissue. Some chroniclers claim the executioner removed Wallace's heart while it still beat, though modern medicine suggests he would have gone into cardiac arrest before that. Still, the detail illustrates just how long Wallace endured. Forensic understanding tells us the human body can survive astonishing trauma. Shock would have hit fast, but the elevation of the table kept blood flowing to his brain. The slow pacing of the cuts minimized blood loss. Wallace's mind itself remained trapped inside a shell that was being systematically dismantled. He would have felt cold spreading from his limbs, his mouth dry with a thirst the body produces when fluid levels drop catastrophically. Confusion, disorientation, even hallucinations could set in, but awareness remained. Witnesses from the time said victims of this kind of execution could stay conscious for up to 15 minutes after evisceration began. 15 minutes of watching yourself be undone, of smelling your own body burn, of feeling every nerve-ending scream. The crowd, once eager, began to shift. Some left. Some stayed but turned their faces away. Even in an age of public executions, there was a limit to what the stomach could bear. The fantasy of justice had become the reality of horror. And then slowly the limits of Wallace's body began to show. His remaining eye rolled back, leaving only white. His mouth stopped forming words, stopped making sound. His chest rose and fell, but shallowly, automatically. Whatever had made him William Wallace, his rage, his courage, his stubbornness seemed to retreat as if preparing for one last offense. The executioner knew the end was near and prepared to finish the job. Beheading required a different kind of blade. The executioner Mellon selected a heavy axe, checking its weight and balance. This final strike had to be clean. A messy beheading would ruin the precision of the ritual and reflect poorly on his skill. Wallace's mutilated body was dragged to the block. If anything remained of his awareness, he may have recognized it as a final mercy. The crowd fell silent, sensing the climax. Mellon raised the axe, high sunlight gleaming off the blade. For a heartbeat, everything paused, blade victim audience frozen, in a perfect image of state-sanctioned death. Then the axe fell. The sound was sickening like meat hitting wood. But the first blow didn't finish the job. Whether due to Wallace's broken posture or a misjudged angle, the axe sank deep but didn't sever the spine. Wallace's body twitched violently, the last sparks of nerve activity jolting through him. The executioner, face grim, raised the blade again. The second swing was perfect. Head separated from shoulders with a clean cut. As was custom, the executioner grabbed it by the hair, lifted it high, and turned to the crowd. "Behold, the head of a traitor," he proclaimed, the ritual words echoing over the blood-soaked ground. Some witnesses swore they saw Wallace's lips still move in that moment's silent prayers, defiance, or the final twitching of dying nerves. But his suffering was over. What followed was mechanical, brutal, and impersonal, the quartering. Wallace's body was laid on a thick wooden block. The executioner switched tools again, this time selecting a massive cleaver. This wasn't wild chopping, but a carefully sequenced dismemberment. Each limb, right arm, left leg, removed with measured strikes following anatomical lines. Each part had a purpose, each was destined for a different city: Newcastle Berwick, Stirling and Perth, public warnings to any who might follow in Wallace's footsteps. It was the final act in a performance designed to erase not just a man, but a movement. And in that goal it failed, because what Edward meant as an ending became instead the forging of a legend. First came the arms cleaved from the shoulders with heavy blows that cracked through bone and sinew in sickening wet bursts. Then the legs followed, severed at the hip joints. Each limb was stripped of excess tissue, carefully wrapped in cloth, and prepared for transport. What remained of Wallace's torso was then split clean down the centre, producing the 4 distinct pieces that gave this punishment its infamous name, quartering. The executioner's assistants worked with the efficiency of a butcher's guild, catching blood in buckets, arranging body parts with grim professionalism, maintaining the ritualized dignity of state-sanctioned murder. The crowd, its bloodlust finally satisfied, began to drift away. Some walked in silence, disturbed by what they had witnessed. Others spoke animatedly, comparing this spectacle to past executions, rating the precision of the executioner's work, like theatre critics discussing a grim performance. Children clung to their parents, who offered simple explanations. This, they were told, is what becomes of men who defy the king. As the scaffold was cleared, the market atmosphere returned. Vendors made final sales to the dispersing audience, hawking meat pies and watered ale. Behind the scenes, Wallace's head was given a different treatment. It was parboiled in a mixture of water and herbs, a primitive embalming technique meant to slow decomposition while preserving facial features. The boiling time had to be exact, too short and rot would set in too long and the face would be ruined. Once cooled, the head was coated in tar, hardened for long-term display, and mounted on a pike. Within hours it was installed on London Bridge, joining the silent, decaying faces of other so-called traitors staring down at the city's travellers. Meanwhile, the 4 quarters of Wallace's body were packed in salt and sealed in specially prepared barrels. Each was sent on its own journey across the realm. One was sent to Newcastle, England's northern fortress. Another to Berwick, the town Wallace had once liberated in his earliest campaign. A third made its way to Stirling, where Wallace had famously defeated the English at Stirling Bridge. The final quarter's destination is debated. Some sources say Perth, others Aberdeen, but the message was unambiguous. Every corner of Scotland would host a fragment of their fallen hero, a grotesque warning that resistance to English rule ended not in glory but in ruin. But this final insult didn't work the way Edward had hoped. He had meant to erase Wallace, to obliterate both body and legend, with an execution so terrifying no one would dare follow in his footsteps. Instead, the horror of Wallace's death transformed him. The dismembered remains meant to inspire dread became objects of pilgrimage. Scots visited these grisly displays not in fear but reverence, honouring the man who had endured the worst tortures England could inflict without yielding. What Edward intended as a lesson in obedience became fuel for rebellion. Among those most deeply affected was Robert the Bruce. Once an uneasy ally of the English, Bruce was reportedly shaken by Wallace's fate. Within a year he raised his own banner of revolt. When asked why he dared the same end, he's said to have replied, better to die like Wallace than live as Edward's subject. Wallace's execution, meant to extinguish the flame of Scottish resistance, had instead become its accelerant. The English chronicles, penned by monks and clerics loyal to the crown, tried to cast the execution as divine justice. They emphasised Wallace's attacks on churches, portraying him as a monster who had finally received what he deserved. But even in these biased accounts, something slips through: an uneasy respect for Wallace's courage, a hint that perhaps the punishment had exceeded justice. Scottish accounts, though fewer and written long after the fact, paint a very different picture. They describe Wallace's poise in the face of agony, his refusal to recant his transformation from rebel to martyr. Walter Bower's Chronicle, written over a century later, claims Wallace spent his final moments in prayer, achieving a kind of spiritual transcendence, even as his body was destroyed. We can't verify those details, but they speak volumes about how desperately the Scots needed to make sense of what had happened. They needed meaning, they needed legend, and so the story spread. Within days of his death, Scottish minstrels began composing songs, not the heroic ballads of later centuries, but raw, mournful laments filled with anger and sorrow. These weren't meant to entertain. They were meant to remember to resist. Travellers carried the songs across the land, spreading Wallace's story faster than any army. The English, recognizing the danger, tried to suppress them. Singing of Wallace became a punishable offence in occupied towns, but it was too late. The myth had already taken root. Wallace's body had been destroyed, but his story was now unstoppable. But trying to silence the songs only gave them more power. Forced underground, they grew darker, angrier, more defiant. And some of the voices keeping Wallace's legend alive weren't even Scottish. They were English soldiers, men who had witnessed the execution firsthand. Many had arrived expecting to watch a monster meet his fate, a savage finally punished. But what they saw was something entirely different. They saw a man endure agony beyond comprehension without surrendering. A man who didn't plead or recant but held firm even as he was torn apart. And that disturbed them. Whispers spread in barracks and taverns, accounts passed soldier to soldier, forming a quiet counter-narrative to the official version. Wallace the barbarian became Wallace the martyr, Wallace the man, and somehow that was far more terrifying than any rebel caricature the Crown could invent. The Scottish Church, which had once been ambivalent or even critical of Wallace during his lifetime, now embraced him in death. Clergy who had once urged peace with England began preaching fiery sermons about the martyred knight. They drew comparisons between Wallace's execution and the Passion of Christ, turning political rebellion into spiritual symbolism. It was a dangerous message, but the moment called for boldness. Wallace's death had presented the Church with a rare opportunity to unify a divided nation through shared outrage and grief. Even the dismemberment, the most gruesome part of Edward's plan, began to fail in its purpose. The quarters displayed in Scottish towns, meant to be warnings, turned into pilgrimage sites. People travelled dangerous roads just to stand near the decaying remains of their hero. English guards noted strange offerings left in the night flowers, scraps of tartan, bits of ribbon. Despite official bans, the people came quietly but persistently. Wallace's broken body was doing in death what it had done in life, defying the Crown through sheer presence. The English administrators in Scotland faced a dilemma. To remove the body parts would be to admit the spectacle had failed, but leaving them up gave Scots daily opportunities to remember, to mourn, to resist. Eventually pragmatism won. The quarters were quietly taken down and disposed of, but rumours spread that loyal Scots had recovered them in secret, buried them in hidden graves. Whether true or not, the story became part of the legend, part of the Wallace that could never be erased. King Edward I died in 1307, just 2 years after Wallace. He died still fighting Scots, still obsessed with completing his conquest. On his deathbed, he reportedly commanded that his bones be carried into battle until Scotland was subdued. But his son Edward II lacked the same fire. He failed to suppress the growing rebellion. And in 1314, at the Battle of Bannockburn, Scotland struck back. The rebellion Wallace had begun, and his death had ignited, triumphed in a resounding victory. Yet the legacy of Wallace's execution reached far beyond Scotland. By trying him as a traitor to a king he had never served, Edward set a precedent with lasting consequences. That legal sleight of hand declaring a foreign fighter a domestic criminal became a tool of imperial power. Future English monarchs would use it to justify brutal crackdowns in Wales, in Ireland, and centuries later in the American colonies. The punishment of hanging, drawing, and quartering became the ultimate message: resist the crown and your body, your soul, your memory would be destroyed. But that message contained its own flaw. What the English never understood is that sometimes martyrdom isn't defeat, it's the most powerful kind of victory. Wallace's broken body accomplished what his sword never fully could. It gave Scotland something more enduring than battlefield glory. It gave them a wound that would never close. Every Scot who heard the details of his death, who imagined his final moments, who whispered his name in defiance, became more resolved, more Scottish, less willing to ever kneel. Wallace didn't just leave behind a legend. He left behind a weapon, a collective grievance that would fuel resistance for generations. The meticulous records of his trial and execution, unusually thorough for the time, reveal that even the English knew they were witnessing a historic moment. They believed they were documenting justice. What they preserved instead was evidence proof of judicial murder, of tyranny wrapped in legal formality, of a crown so afraid of one man's ideals that it tried to erase him piece by piece. Modern forensic reconstructions confirm the unspeakable efficiency of the execution Wallace endured, but even more chilling than the method is the outcome. Edward killed the man, but he created something far more dangerous, a symbol. One that no blade, no fire, no quartering block could ever destroy. Medical experts examining the execution method note that Wallace likely experienced what we now call neurogenic shock, a condition where overwhelming pain overrides the nervous system, disrupting the body's ability to regulate itself. But contrary to the assumption that shock might bring unconsciousness, this form of trauma would have induced a strange detachment. Wallace would have remained aware but separated, watching his own dismemberment from a psychological distance. His mind, overwhelmed by pain, would have retreated into a final corner of consciousness where identity flickered but never fully extinguished. The crowd psychology at executions like Wallace's has been the subject of extensive analysis. These events combined the revelry of a public festival with the cruelty of sanctioned torture, producing a volatile social alchemy. In such environments, otherwise compassionate individuals became participants in spectacle. Their empathy gave way to the energy of the crowd, their sense of morality dulled by ritual and repetition. But Wallace's execution, even within this brutal tradition, seems to have shattered that boundary. Reports of long silences during the worst moments of people turning away, even abandoning the scene entirely, suggest that the extremity of Wallace's suffering exceeded what most could endure. The spectacle designed to terrify may have instead awakened unease. Wallace's transformation from man to myth began the moment his head was mounted on a pike above London Bridge. By the time the poet Blind Harry composed The Wallace in the 1470s, the historical figure had evolved into something larger than life, almost supernatural. These legendary additions weren't mere exaggerations, they were necessary. The raw facts of Wallace's death were already epic in their horror. To match the depth of national trauma and cultural memory, the myth had to rise even higher. His execution became the emotional and narrative center of every retelling. Some versions described him singing psalms as his entrails burned, others granted him divine visions in his final moments. But the constant thread was transformation, turning mutilation into martyrdom, agony into transcendence. Where English chroniclers saw a criminal getting his due, Scottish storytellers saw a man elevated through suffering. Wallace's defiant words at trial that he could not be a traitor to a king he never acknowledged became more than a legal defense. They became a declaration of political philosophy. The idea that allegiance must be given, not taken by force, was revolutionary. Wallace didn't intend to birth a theory of resistance, but his refusal to legitimize Edward's rule echoed across generations. Future movements for freedom would cite his words as proof that sovereignty without consent was tyranny. The graphic details preserved in medieval chronicles serve a deeper historical function than simple shock. They reveal the calculated nature of medieval state violence, how power was asserted not just by swords and armies, but through the systematic destruction of rebel bodies. Wallace's execution was a public script, a performance in which pain became propaganda. Understanding this horror doesn't glorify it. It helps us grasp the scale of courage it took to stand against such a system and the limitations of terror as a tool of rule. Wallace's death was meant to end resistance. Instead, it became the clearest sign that the English crown feared the power of one man's defiance. Each generation of Scots reinterpreted Wallace through its own lens. During the Protestant Reformation, he was recast as a proto-martyr resisting religious tyranny. In the Enlightenment, he symbolized rational resistance to oppression. For 19th century romantics, he embodied a heroic spirit of national identity crushed by imperial greed. His body may have been destroyed, but his story adapted flexing to meet the needs of each new political moment. Physical places linked to his death became sites of collective memory. London Bridge, where his head once stared down at the city, remained in Scottish imagination a symbol of conquest and injustice, long after the original structure was gone. Smithfield, where he was executed, took on an air of cursed ground proof that even England had overstepped divine tolerance. And Westminster Hall, where his show trial took place, bore the permanent taint of judicial murder in Scottish memory. What endures across all versions of the Wallace story is the execution scene, Not because of its cruelty alone, but because it marks the exact moment when history gave way to myth, where flesh and blood gave rise to symbol, where a broken body rather than silupen, a people gave them a story they would never forget. No matter how often the story of William Wallace is retold, modernized for film, softened for classrooms, or romanticized in song, the brutal reality of his death resists erasure. The method of execution, hanging, drawing, and quartering is too exact, too well documented, and too unimaginably cruel to be rewritten into something clean or noble. That specificity forces even the most mythic portrayals to grapple with the truth that the price of resistance in medieval Europe was not simply death, but a calculated obliteration designed to erase body, spirit, and legacy. And yet Wallace's death didn't erase anything. It grounded his legend in undeniable historical fact. English records, including the recently discovered pipe roll entry listing the expenses of Wallace's execution, provide unintentional validation of his significance. The Crown's meticulous accounting covering costs of transport, execution materials, and the distribution of body parts shows that this was no ordinary rebel being punished. This was a message. The government wasn't just removing a threat, it was curating a spectacle, one that would echo across generations. They were making history and they knew it. They just misjudged what kind of history they were making. The psychological impact of Wallace's execution on Robert the Bruce is often overshadowed by battlefield victories, but it deserves deeper attention. Bruce had worked with the English, even aided in efforts to capture Wallace. For him to witness Wallace endure tortures he had escaped to see a man die with honour for a cause Bruce had compromised must have awakened something deeper than political strategy, guilt, shame, and the need for redemption. His rebellion, launched less than a year after Wallace's death, can be read not merely as political calculation, but as personal atonement. In this light, Wallace's execution didn't just birth a martyr, it transformed a collaborator into a liberator. As society evolved, so did the reaction to Wallace's death. The method of his execution, once considered a righteous punishment, became an object of moral revulsion. During the Enlightenment, philosophers and reformers cited Wallace as an example of barbarism that civilized nations must never repeat. Even supporters of capital punishment came to argue that it must be swift and free of unnecessary suffering. Wallace's drawn-out destruction became a case study in the limits of state violence and a benchmark against which evolving standards of justice were measured. And therein lies the ultimate irony. Had Wallace died on the battlefield or been executed quietly, he might have faded into historical footnotes overshadowed by Robert the Bruce and the eventual victory at Bannockburn. But it was precisely the spectacular nature of his death, the extremity of the suffering meant to erase him, that immortalized him. Edward the in his ruthless determination to extinguish a threat, forged an indestructible symbol. Wallace's body was torn apart, but his story became indivisible from Scottish identity. More than 700 years later, in a world still grappling with power resistance and the legitimacy of rule, Wallace's death remains terrifyingly relevant. His executioners believed they were destroying a dangerous rebel. Instead, they created an immortal symbol, a reminder that even when the body breaks, the human spirit can defy tyranny. His final words at trial still reverberate with quiet power, that true authority requires consent, that sovereignty cannot be imposed by violence alone, and that there are principles so vital, so sacred that they are worth suffering any horror to defend. Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.